The danger zone, why midsummer surface layers are lethal. To the observer walking the high banks in mid-July, the lake appears to have given up its secrets entirely. We'll look out over the flat, glassy expanses and see great dark shapes cruising lazily just inches beneath the surface film, their backs occasionally breaking the water in slow rolling patterns. It is a spectacle that sets an angler's pulse racing, the supreme prize of the venue, completely visible, seemingly within arm's reach. It is easy to view this as a scene of pure opportunity, a golden invitation to cast a bait directly into their path and wait for the inevitable swirl. Yet this serene tableau is one of the greatest illusions the water ever presents to us. Those fish are not patrolling for food, nor are they suspended in a highly fragile state of awareness, and for the unprepared angler, this zone is utterly lethal for your chances to catch. The danger of the midsummer surface layer lies not in the absence of fish, but in the overwhelming presence of them. When the upper margins become congested with the lake's largest inhabitants, our traditional angling instincts begin to work against us. We become impatient, blinded by the sight of target fish, and we throw caution to the wind. We assume that because a carp is visible, it must be vulnerable, but the reality of the surface layer is a harsh lesson in patience and microscopic detail. It is a transient world where the slightest atmospheric shift or a single clumsy movement can instantly terminate your chances for the entire weekend. Welcome to the danger zone, a realm where what looks like a certain capture is actually a masterclass in frustration, and where only the most disciplined approach can break the deadlock. The basking fallacy. The first and most critical mistake we make when targeting surface cruising carp is misinterpreting their state of mind. In the depths of spring or the crisp mornings of autumn, a moving fish is an active fish, a creature hunting with purpose and driven by appetite. But under the heavy glare of July afternoon, these surface-dwelling shoals are operating on a completely different psychological plane. They are basking, absorbing the ambient warmth of the upper layer, using the sun's rays to regulate their systems. Their movements are slow, almost meditative, carried out with a minimum expenditure of energy. They are not looking down at the lake bed, nor are they actively searching the surface for a meal. They are simply existing in the warmth, completely detached from the concept of feeding. When a carp enters the state of lethargic suspension, its feeding trigger becomes incredibly difficult to pull. You can introduce a handful of standard floating biscuits or a beautifully tied surface rig directly into their path, and they will simply drift past it with an agonizing indifference. They might nudge the bait out of casual curiosity or use the displacement of their crews to push it aside without ever opening their mouths. This indifference is incredibly testing for the angler. It tempts you to tweak, to recast, and to interfere with the water, unaware that the fish are fully aware of your presence, but simply lack the biological inclination to respond to a traditional food source. The acoustic mirror. To fish the surface layers successfully, one must understand that the water's surface film behaves like an acoustic mirror, working entirely in favour of the fish. When a carp is sitting down in 8 or 10 feet of water, the surrounding water column acts as a natural buffer, dampening bankside vibrations and shielding them from the minor indiscretions of the angler. But when that fish rises to within a few inches of the air, it is directly exposed to every sound wave that hits the venue. The surface film transmits vibrations with terrifying efficiency. A heavy footstep on a sun-baked bank, the sharp click of a reel clutch, or the shadow of a rod tip cutting across the sky doesn't just startle the surface fish, it sends a physical shockwave through the entire shoal. This heightened sensitivity turns the surface layer into a tactical minefield. The fish are already in a state of high alert simply by being visible in the brightest part of the day. A single clumsy cast that slaps the water with a heavy controller float will clear a bay in seconds, leaving behind nothing but a series of vortexes and a completely barren surface. The collective caution of the shoal is amplified tenfold up here. If one fish senses an anomaly and bolts, the panic spreads instantly through the rest of the group like an electric current, ruining hours of careful stalking in the blink of an eye. The geometry of deception. Because the light is at its most intense during these midsummer sessions, the carp's vision through the upper layers is incredibly sharp. They're looking up into a bright sky, which means anything sitting on or just below the surface film is cast in a stark, uncompromising silhouette. In the dark depths of the lake bed, a thick hook link or a slightly clumsy knot can be masked by the silt and the weed. On the surface, though, there is nowhere to hide. The fish can see the indentation of the monofilament breaking the surface tension, the tiny air bubbles trapped against the grease of the line, and the unnatural angle at which an artificial bait sits in the water. Overcoming this visual barrier requires a total rejection of heavy, cumbersome gear. It demands a transition to ultra-fine, degreased hook links that sit entirely flush with the surface film, and hooks so small and lightweight that they allow the bait to float with absolute authenticity. The geometry of your presentation must be flawless. A carp approaching a surface bait will often drift beneath it for several feet, inspecting it from below with a slow, deliberate scrutiny. If the bait behaves unnaturally, if it drags against the wind, or fails to roll with the gentle movement of the surface film, the fish will simply reject it without a second glance. The art of the intercept. When the fish are locked into these stubborn, non-feeding surface patterns, the traditional tactic of baiting an area and waiting for them to arrive is completely redundant. You cannot build a swim or create a competitive feeding situation when the fish are indifferent to food. Instead, the discipline shifts from standard angling to pure hunting. It becomes an exercise in tracking and interception. You must study the slow, cyclical paths the fish take as they drift through the weed beds, identifying the exact gaps and channels where their path is entirely predictable. Success in these conditions relies on placing a single, low-impact bait far in advance of a cruising fish, allowing the water to settle completely before the carp arrives. The bait must be positioned so perfectly that the fish simply encounters it as a natural piece of debris drifting in its line of sight. It is a game of inches and immense restraint. You do not cast at the fish, you cast to where the fish will be in 3 minutes' time. By letting the carp swim into the trap entirely on its own terms, without the sudden disturbance of a recent cast, you remove the element of suspicion and coax them into an opportunistic, instinctive error. The solitary prize. As you spend more time watching these midsummer shoals, a fascinating social dynamic becomes apparent. While the younger, smaller carp often drift together in tight, jittery groups, the truly ancient residents of the venue tend to maintain a distinct, dignified distance. These old, heavy mirrors and long, dark commons do not join in the frantic, erratic movements of the smaller fish. Instead, they hover on the periphery of the sun-drenched bays, often tucked deep inside the heavy shade of an overhanging bramble or suspended over the deepest water just outside the weed margins, completely motionless. Targeting these solitary giants requires an absolute refusal to be distracted by the easier, more active fish in the centre of the bay. It means ignoring the 20 fish that are visible and focusing entirely on the one shadow that is barely discernible in the darkness of the snags. These older fish have survived decades of angling pressure precisely because they avoid the areas of high tension. To fool them on the surface is an ultimate validation of an angler's craft, a capture achieved not through the brute force of heavy baiting, but through total stealth, flawless presentation, and a deep respect for the fish's environment. the sinking sun. When the long, suffocating heat of the day finally begins to fracture and the evening shadows lengthen across the margins, the surface layers lose their intense bright glare. The shoals that spend the afternoon suspended in the sun begin to slip away, sinking back down into the darker contours of the lake bed as the water temperature drops. As you watch the water settle back into a perfect dark mirror, you realize that the long hours of watching and waiting were not a waste of time. They were an initiation into the true nature of the venue, a reminder that the most compelling chapters of angling are written when the fish are fully visible, challenging us to match our patience against their primitive instinct, and reminding us that the water always holds the final hand. There is a profound stillness that descends upon a lake when the world goes quiet, a brief window where the line between the air and the water seems to dissolve entirely. The daytime restlessness fades away, leaving behind nothing but the slow, rhythmic pulse of the natural world. In these fleeting moments, success isn't measured by what you carry away from the bank, but by what you manage to leave behind. The noise, the distraction, and the frantic pace of the everyday. To stand in the fading light and simply witness the lake breathe is a victory in itself. It is a quiet reassurance that as long as these wild, forgotten corners exist, there will always be a place for the patient soul to find its grounding.